The record reflect we are back in session. Parties and counsel are present. All members of our jury and our alternates are present. And Ms. Rodriguez, you may continue your examination.
Thank you, Your Honor. When we left off, we were talking about keeping the business afloat after the family went missing in February of 2010. Who did you have discussions with about keeping the business going?
My son and Chase.
Do you remember having any discussions with the defendant when he came to see you on that date that we identified on the calendar on February 9th, before the family was reporting missing, and he came to your house? Were there any discussions about the business at that time?
No.
Do you remember talking to Detective Steers about that visit on the 9th and telling him that the defendant had talked to you about needing money?
Yes.
What do you remember about that?
Not a lot.
Would it refresh your recollection to look at that portion of your report with Detective Steers?
Yes.
7140. Did that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
So when the defendant came to your house on February 9th, what was the part of the conversation that dealt with the business?
Well, that he had to finish some fountains that had to get out to be delivered.
Was there any discussion of money?
Yeah, they needed to get some money from Joey so he could complete these jobs.
And in the part that you just read, was there any indication or was there any conversation that you had with the defendant about Dan Kavanaugh contacting the defendant?
Yes.
And what was that?
Because Dan could also possibly give him funds to complete the job.
So was it your understanding, based on your conversation with the defendant, that Dan Kavanaugh had also contacted the defendant?
I can't say for sure if Dan called him, for sure.
Was that what the defendant told you?
That he had talked to him, but...
Okay. Did you have additional conversations with the defendant about what was going on with Joe and the business?
That day?
No, during the several months that followed.
Yes.
And when you talked to the defendant, what did the primary concern seem to be?
Speculation.
Sustained this phrase, calls for speculation and conclusion.
Sure. When you talked to the defendant, what did he talk to you about?
There were jobs that needed to be completed but needed funds to complete them.
Were those conversations at all about what happened to Joe?
In the beginning, we were doing flyers and media and all of that, so I had asked him to participate in that, and he wouldn't.
Objection not responsive.
Overruled. Next remain.
And let's talk for a few minutes about the financing and funds that you had access to and that were around around the time that Joe disappeared. You mentioned previously that there was a Union Bank account. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Do you know of any other accounts that were in existence at that time?
I checked for a Bank of America account and something about an X-Trade account.
Do you know anything about a PayPal account?
Yes, and a PayPal.
Okay, do you know what a PayPal account is?
It's not exactly.
Okay. Were you familiar with it at that time?
No.
Is it something that you had to learn a little bit about after Joe and his family disappeared?
Yes.
Did you ever have access to that PayPal account?
No.
Do you know who did have access to the PayPal account?
Joey, and I thought Dan had access to it.
And do you know if the defendant had access to that?
He did not.
How do you know that?
Because of what my son kept his, because my son told me it was just him or Dan.
Did he tell you why the defendant didn't have access to that account?
Just the way he ran his business.
I'm sorry,
Objection hearsay.
sustained.
Did you ever, at some point, give the defendant access to that PayPal account?
No.
Why not?
I had no access to it.
Did you have access to other funds for the business?
Not, yes.
Did you allow the defendant to have access to those funds?
No.
Why not?
Objection A.
Overruled. You can answer.
Oh, thank you. It's a personal account.
Do you recall Joe telling you anything about the defendant that impacted your decision to allow the defendant to have access to the funds?
Objection called for hearsay.
Sustained on that sustained.
Could you repeat the question?
You don't need to answer, it's okay.
Did you ever tell or have a conversation with Dan about the business account, the PayPal account?
Yes.
Did you ever tell Dan to take money from the PayPal account?
No. We had to get permission.
From who? Do you ever recall telling one of the detectives that you told Dan to take money from the business account for child support for Jonah?
Correct.
So let me back that up then. Did you have a conversation with Dan where you told him to take money from the PayPal account?
Correct.
Tell us about that conversation.
I had asked Mr. DeGaulle if some funds could go toward child support for Joey's son, and he permitted it. I guess that at the time the account was unlocked, so Dan could pull some funds to give to child support.
Did you ever meet with Dan Kavanaugh and the defendant regarding the business?
Yes.
When did that occur?
And I'm not sure what month. March, April. I'm not sure what month.
Do you recall telling one of the detectives that it was in March of 2010?
I can't say for sure the date.
Again, would it be fair to say that when you talked to the detectives that the events that occurred back in 2010 were fresher in your mind back then?
Much fresher.
How was it that that meeting came to be?
Chase and I were there at Kavanaugh's apartment, and since he's the IT guy, he was fixing something on or doing something with my computer.
How was it that the meeting even came to fruition? How did you end up going to Dan's apartment?
It was some sort of a program, so you could see what was coming in and what was going out as far as business accounts or business names.
I'm sorry, maybe my question isn't clear. When you went to Dan's apartment in March of 2010, how did that meeting come about? Who decided to have the meeting?
All of us.
Tell us about how that conversation occurred.
Dan was going to put something or a program or whichever into my account so that I could help keep the business going.
Whose idea was that?
Well, Dan's to put it in.
And how, you indicated that you had that conversation with Dan, or you went to Dan's. How did the defendant become part of that meeting?
Chase and I went down together.
How did the defendant know about that meeting?
Obviously, we talked about it. Yes.
So when you say that you and the defendant went down, how did you get down there?
I believe it was in my car at the time.
How did you meet up with the defendant?
We drove together, I believe, the first time. I'm not for sure.
And where did you go?
To San Diego, close to downtown area.
Who lived down there?
Dan Cavanaugh lived in one of those high-rise kind of like buildings.
Had you been there before?
Never, first time.
What happened when you got there for the meeting?
We talked a little bit about how to keep the business together until we could find my son and his family. And at the time, there were certain orders that needed to get done and get out. And that, there was money needed.
What else was discussed?
And the computer part.
At some point during that meeting, did it get heated?
Just a little on that meeting.
What happened during that meeting?
We walked somewhere downtown in San Diego and got this program or whatever, and went back and he put it in. And then wanted to know if, I can keep, because people were calling my house, keeping the business calm to keep it going so that when we found him, Joey would still have a business.
Did anything happen between the defendant and Dan at that meeting?
They had their words, yes.
What was that about?
It's because he wanted money and Dan didn't want to put out any money. Said, you've had enough.
Objection hearsay, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Who wanted money?
Chase needed money to complete the orders, he said.
And you indicated that Dan said he had had enough?
You were already given this money to complete these jobs.
And can you describe the exchange between the two of them? Was it angry or calm, or how did that go?
It wasn't yelling and screaming on that meeting. We had 2 meetings.
When was the next meeting?
After that, we went back down to Dan's and was going over the fountains and the accounts, and that's when it was super, Dan and Chase yelling at each other. I mean, really, really bad, really loud.
Was that on the same date or a different date?
Different date.
Do you know if you told the detective about that meeting?
I don't remember if I had or hadn't.
Okay. And you indicated that the first time you met was sometime in March or April. When did the second meeting take place?
I don't know how many weeks after the first meeting. I can't remember exactly.
What happened during that second meeting?
Again, the money situation, and they were definitely yelling big time at each other, arguing, and Dan just wasn't going to budge. And it was, to me at the time, very scary, so I literally walked out and said, if my son loses his business, so be it. I need to find my family. And I left.
And during that meeting, did you ever hear anything that the defendant said to Dan?
There was a lot of cussing.
Do you recall any threats?
Yes.
Do you remember what was said?
Well, like he'd like to kick his, I don't know if I can say this in court, can
You can say it.
I? A lot of cussing, a lot of cussing, screaming at each other, you know. I want to keep the business going, and Chase wanted to wring his neck.
Okay. You indicated that you left, is that correct?
I did. It was very heated, and I walked out.
Why did you leave?
Didn't feel right. It was very scary. I left.
Did you yourself ever provide the defendant with any money?
I did.
When did you start providing the defendant with money?
I can't give an exact date.
Okay. I'm going to approach with Exhibit 566. Okay. And if you could take a look at these, and we'll have an opportunity to go through them, but if you could take a look at those and tell me if you recognize those.
Yes,
Are those all checks that you wrote?
it is.
And we'll start with the first one. And it's dated March 31st of 2010. Is this a check that you wrote to the defendant?
Yes.
Yes.
Why did you provide him this check?
It was funds to finish the jobs, to keep the business going, all of these.
Who asked you for the money?
Chase.
And moving on to the next check. Can you tell us what this is?
It's another check I gave to Chase in April.
In April? April 22nd?
Correct.
And what did you think that this check was for?
Or the fountains.
Is that what you were told?
Yes.
And just to back up for a second, where is this money coming from that you're writing to him, these checks?
From my personal account.
Moving on to the next check. Can you tell us what this is?
Another check,
And when is this one from?
April 28th for $1,000.
And when, what was this for?
Something related to the fountains or parts or the business.
So these, well, let me go ahead and finish. We'll go on to the next one. And what is this check for?
That was in May. I don't remember if that was for his passport or if his passport was more than that amount.
So this is May 3rd of 2010, and it's for $200.
Yes,
And it's either for a passport or what else would it have been for?
or something
Okay.
related to the business.
Okay, moving on to the next check. What can you tell us about this check?
That is probably the passport, $250.
And when was
dated
this?
5/12.
Okay. And what was the passport, what was the check for a passport for?
He was going to complete a job in Saudi Arabia and said he didn't have funds for the passport.
Okay. And the next check? I think they might be out of order. And what's the date of this check?
April 11th.
Is it May 11th or April 11th?
I'm sorry, May 11th,
And how much is this check for?
$560.
And do you know what this check was for?
Obviously, it was from some glass company.
Was that something, what was the purpose of the glass, if you know?
It's a part of the fountain.
Okay. Were all of those checks that you wrote from your personal account?
Correct.
And how was it that you came to write these checks to the defendant? What was it that happened that caused you to give those checks to the defendant?
To keep the business going.
How did you know that he needed that money to keep the business going?
Because when the fountain would be completed, he would take a picture of it to show the fountain was completed. So,
How did it come about, though, that you actually gave him money for those?
because he asked for funds to keep the business going, and at that time, I would do anything to help my son because I'm probably not in my right mind anyways at that time. So you just do what you can for your son and his family.
So when we see these checks for the various amounts, how would you know what amounts you needed to write the check for?
Because he would tell me what amount.
So he would call you and tell us what would happen when he would call you for a certain amount.
Depending on what it was for, he would just call, and if I was in the area of the bank, he'd just meet me at the bank and I'd give him a check, or depending on the circumstances at the time.
Okay, so sometimes you would meet him at the bank.
Correct.
Would there be other ways that you would give checks to him?
I usually met him because it was closer to where he lived and I was south of there. So I can't remember exactly when I always handed these checks out.
During that time frame where you're providing checks to the defendant, did you ever receive any phone calls from customers?
Yes.
Tell us about phone calls that you received.
I remember one from Saudi Arabia, and I couldn't figure out how they got my landline, but then it was not listed. I mean, it was listed so you could. So man kept calling at 2 and 3 in the morning, wanting his fountains.
Okay. What did you do about that phone call?
I explained that my family was missing and that I had nothing to do with what's going on with his, at the time, his fountain, so I couldn't do anything for him.
Did you ever receive any other phone calls from individuals that hadn't received their fountains?
I received a couple others, but I don't remember the names.
Do you remember a company by the name of Geis Construction at all?
What's the name?
Geis?
I don't remember that.
Okay. Did you do anything after you received those phone calls?
I let Chase know that, obviously, and Dan, that, someone's calling from far away.
Did you ever give Dan any checks?
No.
When you received that call from the fountains in Saudi Arabia, was that after you had purchased a passport for the defendant?
Before.
When provided that money to the defendant for those fountains, was there any sort of an agreement that you were going to be paid back?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, it was agreed that I would, receive my funds back, especially from some of the bigger fountains that he had that, money would come in, but I never saw any.
Do you know if the defendant ever received any money for the fountains?
I don't know.
Did you ever meet the defendant anywhere at a shop where the fountains were constructed?
Yes.
Where was that?
In Azusa,
And what was the purpose of that meeting?
to see where Chase was building the fountains and for me to meet the people who also work there.
And do you remember what the name of that place was?
No.
Do you remember a place called Metro Sheet Metal?
Yes, I do.
And does that sound familiar?
Yes.
And what happened when you went to Metro Sheet Metal?
I met the owner of the company and his son, and then was shown a tour of the warehouse to see, where they were being built.
Who else was at that meeting?
Chase,
Anybody else?
I don't know.
Did you ever provide any checks to Metro Sheet Metal at that meeting?
No.
And do you recall, did you actually go inside of the business?
Yes.
Do you recall how the business was laid out at all?
Yes, we had offices in the front and a big warehouse in the back.
Did you go into the back where the warehouse was at all?
I did.
And what, did you see anything in particular in the back when you went into the back where the fountains were built?
Some of the parts and things that go into the fountains, but there were other work areas in there for whatever it is that they made.
Were the work areas separated at all?
Kind of walked through it, but it's a very large area with big doors in the back.
Is it your understanding that this was where Joe had done some of his fountains?
Yes.
Okay. And now you testified previously that you don't recall if the defendant said he received any money for the fountains that he built. Do you remember that?
Repeat that again?
Sure. I had asked you if you recall, you had given defendant money, and if you remembered if the defendant had told you he had received any money from the fountains. Do you remember me asking you that?
Yeah.
Okay. You gave the defendant money for fountains, correct?
Correct.
Did the defendant ever tell you if he received any money after he built those fountains?
I don't know.
Would it refresh your refresh your recollection to look at your report?
Yes.
Okay. 7150. So did that refresh your recollection?
Yes, it did.
Did the defendant ever tell you if he received money for completing the fountains?
He had said that he would receive the money from the Saudi job.
And did he tell you if he actually completed that job?
Correct. If he completed it, he would take the money.
Did he tell you if he actually got paid that money?
I never knew for sure if he got paid. I never knew if he even went over there.
Did you just have the opportunity to review that portion of your report?
Correct.
To Detective Steers? Do you recall telling Detective Steers that the defendant said he completed the job and was paid out $17,000 directly to him?
That's what was said, but I don't know for sure.
But that's what the defendant told you.
Correct.
Did you ask him to be reimbursed?
I felt that was Joey's funds for the company, not his.
Do you remember telling Detective Steers, though, that you asked to be reimbursed for the money that you had given the defendant to complete the job?
To be reimbursed for some funds, yes, I have asked.
Did you ever receive those funds?
I did not.
Okay. Now, during the years that the family was missing, did you continue to have contact with Detective Dugal?
Yes.
And in that period of time, we saw several checks up through what appeared to be May that you had given the defendant. Did you continue to have contact with the defendant to try to keep the business afloat during that time period?
No, after that, there was no contact.
Now, you indicated that you had gone to the family house in Fallbrook in about May or June with Summers' family. Did that house eventually get repossessed?
It did.
Were you contacted in November of 2013 about Joe and the family?
Yes.
What were you told?
My son called me, Mikey, and I was at my office. It was my day off, but I was there working. And he told me they found their bodies, and they were dead, all of them. And I fell to the ground, and my partner got help for me.
Do you need to take a break, Susan?
Go ahead.
What happened next after you heard from Mike?
He kept calling, and I couldn't talk right away because of meetings, and then he was worried. I kept asking questions like, "Are you alone?" And then obviously the hardest thing my son had to do was tell me that they found him in the desert, and he met with a sheriff or someone, and that they were dead. And I didn't believe it, or I didn't want to believe it.
What did you do after he told you what had happened to the family and you had some conversations with him? You stated that you were at work. Where were you working at that time?
I was working in Valencia, and my partner got some of my crew, which are construction guys that are very good to me, and they drove me home. And then my best friend Emily obviously saw something on the news and had called me and was already coming over to pick me up and take her to her house.
Where was home for you at that time?
Agora, off of Keenan Road in Agora.
What happened after you went home?
He collapsed, and I just couldn't believe it. Just couldn't believe that my family was gone. So we had to be at the sheriff's department that next morning. So Emily picked me up and took me over.
Was anybody at the house with you at Agora Hills when you went home?
Just my construction guys that helped me get my vehicles home and stuff, and then they left. So I was alone for maybe 30 minutes.
You were alone for 30 minutes, and then did someone come over?
My friend Emily came. Yes.
And where was Mike at that time?
I don't know exactly. I mean, he had to go home and tell his family and his daughters. So
you indicated that the day after that you had to go to the sheriff's department. What
Yes.
happened when you went to the sheriff's department?
They took us all in a room with Summer's family and talked about things that happened. And then we had to meet with all the press.
Do you remember what day it was that Mike called you and told you about the fact that they found Joe and the family?
Day of the week, I do not remember.
Would it be fair to
Tuesday
say
or
that?
Wednesday.
Can you describe for us what you were feeling during that time period?
I was off that day and went to the dentist and was numb. And then went to the office to catch up.
And then after Mike called you, how were you feeling at that time?
I kept saying it, and no, it can't be. I asked him what about the little guys, and he told me that they were also gone. I literally don't remember everything because I fell to the floor in the office, and then how can you take all this in?
So would it be fair to say that finding that out and that information maybe has an impact or has an impact on your ability to recall the date and things like that?
Yes.
After you had that conversation at the sheriff's department, did you have additional interviews with the sheriff's department?
Yes.
And at that time, they were asking you, well, what were they talking to you about when you interviewed with them?
They explained kind of the process of, the media being out there, and they're going to ask a lot of questions, and you're just numb. You just don't even know what you're doing.
Was, to your knowledge, did they start doing an additional investigation?
I assume so. I don't know.
Well, do you recall getting interviewed a couple of additional times by San Bernardino detectives?
Yes.
When they talked to you, the San Bernardino detectives, they came and talked to you, what were they asking you about?
Objection made.
Overruled, that you can answer.
They would ask me if I thought anyone if I had any clues of who might do this to the family, or they had anyone that was mad at them, or different things like that.
Did they also ask you about and kind of take you back to the events that occurred in 2010? Did they go back to the very beginning?
No.
Do you recall meeting with Detective Steers and taking out a calendar and kind of trying to piece together different dates and things like that?
Yes. I kept a calendar.
Do you recall going through that with Detective Steers, though?
Yes.
And when you were interviewed by the sheriff's department, again, taking you back, would it be fair to say that the events that had occurred in 2010 were probably fresher in your mind back then than they were in 2013 and 14?
Yes.
Were you given a location as to where the family had been found?
I was.
Where were you told they were found?
I was told they were found in the desert in Victorville.
Had you ever been to that area before?
I couldn't go at all right away to that spot. I didn't go for at least 6 months or more.
Had you ever been up in that area prior to that?
No.
So it took you about 6 months, you said, to go up there?
Yes. It was after Easter.
And can you describe what it was like up there?
I went with my friend, and it's hard to find, so we walked a long time in areas we didn't even know. I've never walked in the desert, and it was hot. So we were obviously in the wrong area. And then a car pulled up, and it was someone that we knew. And I had asked them if they knew exactly which way to go, and they pointed us in the right direction. So me and my friend went to see the Four Crosses, and it just dropped me to my knees, because it shouldn't be. It just shouldn't be. It's just such a shock to see that. I'll never go back to that spot. So I've only been there once.
All right, I think this might be a good time to break through.
Sure. We'll go ahead and take our new recess at this time till 1:30. Again, keep in mind the admonitions not to form or express any opinions about the case, not to discuss the case, or allow anyone to discuss the case with you or in your presence. See everyone back at 1:30.